Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, like so many of us here, I've been watching and listening to my colleagues speak on the floor about the Judge Kavanaugh nomination for several days. And like so many of my colleagues, I want to commend Senator Collins of Maine for her thorough, detailed, and eloquent remarks yesterday. Sometimes a member gives a speech that we know will always be remembered because of its thoroughness, its seriousness, its thoughtfulness, statesman-like quality. I think we all are in agreement that that happened yesterday with Senator Collins. I also want to highlight my very good friend, Senator Murkowski's remarks last night. While we voted differently yesterday and will most likely do so again in a few hours, she made some important points, particularly regarding some of the issues surrounding this confirmation process as it relates to our great state of Alaska. I very much appreciate her friendship, and like so many, I know this process has been difficult for her, as she talked about that last night. In fact, Mr. President, for millions of Americans, and no doubt thousands of Alaskans, the process to confirm Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court has been a searing one. Searing. Certainly for Judge Kavanaugh and his family, for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and her family, for this family, the U.S. Senate family. It's been a difficult period. It has also evoked very traumatic memories of experiences that far too many women in Alaska and America have had. Far too many. And I'm hopeful that in the aftermath of all this, we can go through a much-needed period of healing. Now, Mr. President, as you know, the advise and consent responsibility of the Senate is a solemn one of the most important responsibilities we have here. The process I went through in order to cast my vote for Judge Kavanaugh today has been extensive and thorough, and I believe fair, which is what I believe my constituents back home in Alaska demand of me. After the President announced Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, I read hundreds of pages of decisions that he authored. I listened to the views of Alaskans and have continued to do so up until yesterday. Those who are in favor, those who oppose. And in my first meeting several weeks ago with Judge Kavanaugh, we discussed at length and in great depth his viewpoint on a variety of national and Alaska-focused legal issues. Now, that wasn't the first time I had met Judge Kavanaugh. In fact, I had known him back when we served together in the Bush administration. I knew him as an honest and dedicated public servant, and I actually followed his career as a judge on the D.C. Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. The lengthy meeting in my office convinced me that he is someone who will interpret the law and Constitution as written. He understands the importance of separation of powers and federalism, holds a healthy skepticism regarding the expansive power of federal agency, and that he is a strong protector of the Second Amendment. All issues that are very important to my constituents that they care deeply about, which is why I focused on these issues in my discussions with Judge Kavanaugh in my office several weeks ago. I was convinced then, and remain so, that he is well qualified to be a justice on the United States Supreme Court. But, Mr. President, as we all know, after a number of these meetings, several weeks in my case after meeting with Judge Kavanaugh, two issues arose that I took very seriously. The first was a claim that if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh would not fully recognize or respect the rights of Alaska Native people and the U.S. government's trust responsibilities to them, very important constituents of mine. The Alaska Federation of Natives a very important group back home in Alaska that represents the Native people of my great state, wrote a memo speculating how Judge Kavanaugh, if confirmed, would threaten unique laws and programs for the Alaska Native people. The second issue that arose, of course, that we have been debating here, and the country is fully aware of, was the allegation that Judge Kavanaugh sexually assaulted Dr. Ford in 1982 when she was 15 and he was 17. Like many senators here, I put my heart and soul into investigating such claims, particularly given how important both of these issues were to my constituents, and I want to address each of these in turn. Mr. President, the Alaska Federation of Natives, AFN as we call it back home, memo was focused on concerns stemming from an amicus brief written by Judge Kavanaugh 18 years ago when he was a private attorney in a case dealing with indigenous Hawaiians before the U.S. Supreme Court called Rice v. Cayetano, in which the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 7-2 opinion, essentially agreed with Judge Kavanaugh's position. Now, Alaska Natives make up roughly 20% of my state. They are incredible Americans, patriotic, hardworking, a beautiful culture, and their legal and sovereign rights, which are based on the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes, have been extremely hard fought, including in this body, over decades. And such rights are fundamental to the health and well-being of Alaska Natives in my state. After the AFN legal memo and similar letters and op-eds were published back home in Alaska, I sent them to the White House for Judge Kavanaugh's review. I then spoke directly to him about these issues. He reiterated to me in a thoughtful and thorough discussion that the legal rights of Alaska Natives, to include tribes and regional and village corporations, were very clear and well established in the law, which is actually different from the situation of indigenous Hawaiians. Therefore, the views expressed by the Supreme Court in the Cayetano opinion that limit the rights of Native Hawaiians do not extend to Alaska Natives and are not applicable legally in any way in Alaska. This is because Congress has repeatedly and explicitly recognized rights and the tribal status for Alaska Natives, including the federal government's trust responsibility, while unfortunately, in my view, Congress has not done the same for Native Hawaiians. Senator Murkowski was on the floor last night. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think the Alaska delegation has always tried to be supportive of the Hawaiian delegation in this regard, and we continue to be. But legally, they're very different, and in a response to a question for the record to Judge Kavanaugh released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, Judge Kavanaugh unequivocally endorsed this point. He stated, now this is his language, the Supreme Court has recognized that Congress has the ability to fulfill its treaty obligations with Native Alaskan regional and village corporations and American Indian tribes through legislation specifically addressed to their concerns. Unlike indigenous people of Hawaii, Congress has explicitly recognized in statute that Indian tribe includes any recognized Indian or Alaska Native tribe, band, pueblo, village, or community. Native Alaskans are Indian tribes and therefore enjoy all the relevant rights and benefits that come with their trust relationship with the United States, unquote. In my conversations with Judge Kavanaugh about Alaska Native legal issues, he also reiterated a point emphasized by Chief Justice Roberts in the recent Supreme Court case called the Sturgeon case, that because of federal statutes like the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, Congress has repeatedly made clear that Alaska is different in many ways from the lower 48, and he recognized and told me, as part of this confirmation process, that many legal issues involving my state need to be viewed through that lens. To be perfectly clear, Mr. President, if I believed or saw evidence that Judge Kavanaugh's view views were somehow opposed to or hostile to Alaska Natives, a very important population of my state that happens to include my wife and my 3 daughters and my mother-in-law, I would not support his confirmation. I told Judge Kavanaugh this directly, but that I was also satisfied with his response after we had this discussion, a deep, detailed discussion about these issues. Importantly, Senator Murkowski came to the same conclusion in her discussions with Judge Kavanaugh, and she said as much in her remarks last night. Of course, there's another allegation, a claim that I want to talk about this morning or this afternoon, the allegation that has been the focus of much attention here in the Senate regarding sexual assault that I likewise took extremely seriously. I respect very much Dr. Ford's bravery and sincerity in coming forward to testify in front of the Judiciary Committee. I'm convinced that she went through a traumatic experience that has left deep wounds. I also applaud the bravery of the many women who have called and written and visited my office to share their experiences in this regard. So much of this has been very painful for so many to revisit these episodes. As I repeatedly stated, all allegations of this kind of conduct should be seriously looked at. So I undertook the due diligence that my constituents expect of me and is required of the Senate's important advise and consent role. I watched the Senate Judiciary hearing on this issue, gavel to gavel. I read every piece of information available, including all the interviews conducted under the penalty of perjury by the Senate Judiciary Committee investigators. I read text messages, threads, witness statements, letters between the committee and lawyers who have been involved, and confidential committee documents. I supported and read the professional and thorough supplemental FBI report recently submitted to the Senate, which looked deeper into this allegation and spoke to additional witnesses in relation to it. And most importantly, Mr. President, I met with and heard from hundreds of Alaskans who have suffered from sexual abuse and domestic violence. Many flew thousands of miles, most on a moment's notice, to come to my office and to meet with me and Senator Murkowski. I applaud their bravery and their passion. So much of this process has been painful for them. Alaska is an amazing state. I come down to the floor all the time to talk about its majesty and beauty and our wonderful people, and I believe that in my soul. But one area where we are not so great or wonderful or majestic is this. My state has the highest rates of sexual assault and domestic violence in the country by far, in almost every category. It's a horrible, horrible thing, and it impacts so many families in the last frontier, horribly. Throughout my public career in Alaska, I've worked to combat sexual assault and domestic violence by putting more offenders in jail, bringing more resources to survivors, including much-needed legal services, and raising awareness of this heinous problem by working to change the culture of violence that's too pervasive in my state. We have a lot more work to do on this issue in Alaska and across America, including on our college campuses, and I applaud Senator Gillibrand for her leadership in this area and many other senators as well. The allegations by Dr. Ford have been difficult and wrenching here in the Senate to address. But one thing is clear to me, her allegations have been taken seriously as they should have been. Mr. President, I have a summary from the Judiciary Committee on its investigation into these and other allegations that I would like to submit for the record.
Without objection.
It shows a staff of over 20 members of the Judiciary Committee literally working around the clock for weeks on all leads, any lead that came in on these serious allegations, These investigators who have the authority of the law, if people speak to them and they lie, they commit perjury. They spoke to more than 35 individuals pursuing any and all substantive leads. This is in addition to the FBI report. And I want to commend Chairman Grassley for his serious and diligent work in this regard in the work of the committee. Wasn't highlighted a lot, but it's very serious work. Some of it, a lot of it's detailed here. Two important points stand out from this work, Mr. President. First, the committee has not obtained or received any evidence that would corroborate the claims made by Dr. Ford. And they've talked to and tried to pursue leads in so many different areas. Dr. Ford's allegations were investigated respectfully and thoroughly by this Senate Judiciary staff and the FBI. And as I mentioned, she certainly had courage in coming forward. Nevertheless, these allegations were not corroborated. The four people Dr. Ford claims were present had no knowledge or memory of any such event, and the others the FBI asked about the alleged incident had no knowledge either. One of them, a lifelong friend of Dr. Ford's, Leyland Kaiser, said she didn't even know Judge Kavanaugh. Again, Mr. President, as you know, all of these statements were made under the penalty of perjury. Another important point from the Judiciary Committee summary, again, I would suggest people take a look at it given the seriousness of the allegations and the seriousness of the investigation, that has not been picked up on is that the minority staff of the committee, those representing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, refused to participate in most of these investigations, sometimes not attending any interviews at all. And when they did, they refused to ask questions. Now, Mr. President, this is truly a mystery to me. One of the constant refrains in arguments, and I'm saying it's been in good faith from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, which continues today, is the need for more investigations into the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. They've been making that argument very regularly, and yet when you read what happened in the committee, they have refused to take part in almost any part of the intensive ongoing investigations from the Judiciary Committee staff investigators, of which there are 20, and they've been working on this diligently. Now, I'm not a member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. President, but it's my understanding that this is a very significant break from past bipartisan investigations that have almost always occurred on the Judiciary Committee for every other previous Supreme Court nominee. So I'm not sure why this happened. Perhaps one of my colleagues can explain it, but it does make one wonder. So, Mr. President, where does this leave us? As Alaska's former Attorney General, and now as a U.S. Senator, I strongly believe in ensuring perpetrators of sexual assault pay a very serious penalty. I oversaw prosecutors who put such criminals away for decades and even indicted alleged rapists according to his DNA sequencing in order to toll the statute of limitations for such a crime when we couldn't physically locate the alleged perpetrator. But I also believe that the presumption of innocence is sacrosanct and a fundamental American principle, whether in a criminal trial, in a Senate committee hearing, or the court of public opinion. I'm convinced that due process should apply as much to the Senate's advise and consent responsibility as it should in a court of law. If we lose this basic concept of fairness, then we risk doing irreparable damage to the very foundation of our democracy and core conceptions of American justice and even liberty. We do not want a system of guilty until proven innocent in America. Such a principle can lead to incentivizing false accusations that do lasting damage, especially when coupled with breathless media reports that repeat verbatim such charges. Unfortunately, we have seen this phenomenon during this confirmation process. Now, I am not referring to the allegations of Dr. Ford, which were taken seriously, but in the aftermath of her allegations, some horrendous and what appear to be patently false claims were made against Judge Kavanaugh. Such false allegations do tremendous damage to the accused and his or her family, but just as bad, Mr. President, they also risk undermining the credibility of true victims and true survivors of sexual assault. This is something that's been overlooked, I believe, in these discussions. One of the most disheartening aspects of this confirmation process has been how some of my Senate colleagues and members of the media were so quick to publicly embrace some of the most outrageous and incredible claims made against Judge Kavanaugh. That, for example, he participated in the drugging and raping of women as a teenage boy. A senior member of the Judiciary Committee referenced this sickening, uncorroborated allegation in her opening statement in one of the hearings. The immediate damage to the accused and to his family by such a charge, which reverberated across the nation, was obvious, but less obvious, but perhaps more damaging to so many in the long run, is how such false claims undermine the ability of true victims and real survivors with real claims of sexual assault to get justice to be believed. I certainly hope that this is not one of the outcomes of this dysfunctional confirmation hearing process, but it underscores how and why the entire system of American justice and fairness can be undermined if we abandon the presumption of innocence. Finally, Mr. President, I again want to thank and applaud so many of the women in particular, including so many Alaskans who flew to D.C., who have spoken out about this nomination and have shared stories about their very difficult experiences with assault. I know from being in meetings with them and hearing from them and listening and reading that this process has brought fresh and painful and difficult memories for so many. I want them to know that from the bottom of my heart, I'm committed more than ever to work on combating these horrible crimes and domestic violence and trying to change the culture in our nation to one of respect. And indeed, Mr. President, if there is a silver lining to come out of this contentious confirmation process, it is that the awareness and commitment to do more to combat these horrible crimes has been heightened. I've heard this from many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the past few days, including Senators Murkowski and Senators Collins, Senators Harris and Klobuchar, and I'm certainly committed to working with all of them to make this happen. At the same time, I do not agree with some of the comments made on the floor that a vote in favor of Judge Kavanaugh is somehow condoning sexual assault or somehow not believing all survivors. As Senator Collins stated yesterday, nothing could be further from the truth. A bipartisan majority of U.S. senators, men and women, are likely to vote for Judge Kavanaugh in a few hours. To mark all of them as somehow not caring about the broader issue of sexual assault in America is not only untrue and an affront to them, but undermines the larger cause of working together to combat this issue. Mr. President, I do not believe that this is a binary choice. This is not and should not be a Republican versus Democratic issue. This is actually an American epidemic, and frankly, it should be viewed more as an American male issue. The men are the ones who are committing the vast majority of the abuse. and we need to work together in this body and across the country to be united to stop it. Mr. President, I will be voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh as the next Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. But on this broader topic that I've been discussing this afternoon, our country has a lot of healing and a lot of work to do. And I'm certainly ready to do my part in that regard with all of my Senate colleagues, Republican and Democrat. I yield the floor.
The senator from Maryland.
I thank you, Mr. President. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives this body, the Senate, the responsibility to advise and consent on judicial appointments. It's an important check on executive power. We are invested with this special responsibility to ensure that individuals nominated by the President to be Supreme Court justices will be people who make decisions fairly and impartially, without favor and without bias. That is why Lady Justice wears a blindfold and holds a balanced scale on which to weigh the merits of arguments and claims that come before her. The integrity of the Supreme Court requires that every person who comes before that court can have confidence that each justice will fairly weigh the evidence and the arguments. Mr. President, Judge Kavanaugh does not meet that standard. I had concerns at the very beginning of this process, and I fear it more than ever today at the end of the process. Any remaining hope that Judge Kavanaugh could be trusted to be an impartial justice or perceived to be an impartial justice was shattered by his opening statement at his last hearing. In that statement, which he emphasized, he wrote in his own words, Judge Kavanaugh launched into an ultra-partisan diatribe and wild conspiracy theories. He suggested that Dr. Ford's compelling testimony about her sexual assault was somehow manufactured by Democrats as payback for his participation in the Starr investigation, as if Dr. Ford was an actor in a bitter partisan battle rather than a brave citizen who had come forward to tell her story. While Judge Kavanaugh attempted the other day to walk back his words in his Wall Street Journal op-ed, the damage he did is irreversible. If he is confirmed, hundreds of people who come before the Supreme Court and the millions of Americans whose lives will be affected by his decisions will believe that Judge Kavanaugh has already put his hands on the scale of justice before they have their say in court. That is why, Mr. President, hundreds of law professors, Jesuits, and personal friends withdrew their previous support for his nomination after his statement at that hearing. That is why the American Bar Association has called a meeting to reconsider their endorsement. And that is why former Justice John Paul Stevens took the extraordinary step of saying that Judge Kavanaugh is not fit to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. President, it didn't have to be this way. The process was flawed from the start, and it got worse as time went on. It started when President Trump contracted out the process of picking a Supreme Court nominee to right-wing groups like the Federalist Society, like the Heritage Foundation. During his campaign, candidate Trump said he was going to pick Supreme Court nominees based not on who would be impartial, based not on who would be independent, but based on who would do his bidding on certain issues. He had a number of litmus tests. For example, during the campaign, when talking about the Affordable Care Act, candidate Trump promised that, unlike Chief Justice Roberts, his nominee would, quote, do the right thing, unquote, and get rid of the Affordable Care Act. The Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, they didn't need much coaxing, but they dutifully compiled lists of names of people to fit the bill. And Judge Kavanaugh fit the bill. He fit the bill according to his own former law clerks. One of his former law clerks wrote an article entitled, quote, Brett Kavanaugh said Obamacare was unprecedented and unlawful, unquote, in order to assure people that Judge Kavanaugh would be the Justice Kavanaugh to undo the protections of the Affordable Care Act. Another one of Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks said, and I quote, "No other contender on President Trump's list is on record so vigorously criticizing the Affordable Care Act." These are Judge Kavanaugh's law clerks. Mr. President, we all know that the case of Texas v. United States, which threatens to take away protections from millions of people with pre-existing conditions, is currently making its way through our federal courts as we gather here today. It was filed by a group of 20 Republican attorney generals, and the Trump administration decided not to defend the current law, decided not to defend the Affordable Care Act, and said to these Republican attorney generals, have at it. Get rid of the Affordable Care Act. We know that that case, the Texas case, is very likely to end up in the Supreme Court of the United States. And in Judge Kavanaugh, President Trump has, according to Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks, his man to rule against the Affordable Care Act, and in doing so, stripping millions of Americans from their protections from pre-existing health conditions. On the issue of a woman's right to reproductive freedom and choice, candidate Trump promised he would appoint a justice to take those rights away. Specifically, he said overturning Roe, quote, will happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am appointing pro-life justices on the court, end quote. Again, he found his man in Judge Kavanaugh. And again, we have Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks saying as much. In a July 3rd, 2018, National Review article, one of his former clerks wrote, quote, no court of appeals judge in the nation has a stronger, more consistent record of enforcing restrictions on abortion, end quote. Now, at the confirmation hearing, we all heard Judge Kavanaugh say that Roe v. Wade was an important precedent and said to some senators it was settled law. But we know from many Republican judicial nominees who testified before the Senate about settled law that as soon as they got on the Supreme Court, it's no longer settled. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh, before he was judge, said himself in a 2003 memo, which came to light, quote, I am not sure that all legal scholars refer to Roe as settled law of the land at the Supreme Court level, since the court can always overrule its precedent. A clear indication of where Judge Kavanaugh's reasoning lies, especially in light of the testimony from his own law clerks. If you look at other parts of his record, you'll find that Judge Kavanaugh consistently rules in favor of powerful special interests and against the public interest. He has sided with those who want to lift all the restrictions on political campaign expenditures. In one opinion, Judge Kavanaugh wrote that PACs are constitutionally entitled to raise and spend unlimited money in support of candidates for elected office because it was, quote, implausible, unquote, that contributions from independent groups could corrupt candidates. Those million-dollar expenditures on behalf of candidates, they have no impact on the thinking of that candidate once they're elected, according to Judge Kavanaugh, of course, according to the Citizens United decision. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh has been credited by one campaign finance expert as, quote, the man who created the super PAC, unquote. Judge Kavanaugh has gone farther. He's even suggested that limits on direct contributions to candidates are unconstitutional. Back in March 2002, in an email, he said, quote, "I've heard very few people say that the limits on contributions to candidates are unconstitutional, although I, for one, tend to think those limits have some constitutional problems." So we can see that if it's Justice Kavanaugh, not only will he double down on Citizens United, which says that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money, including unlimited amounts of secret money, but he questions the constitutionality of putting limits not only on independent expenditures, but on direct contributions to candidates. We know Judge Kavanaugh was also the pick for those who want corporate power to trump workers' rights, consumer rights, and environmental protections. The day that Judge Kavanaugh was nominated for the Supreme Court, the White House circulated a letter to corporate leaders touting the fact that he would protect their interests. The White House proudly noted that he has overruled federal regulators 75 times on cases involving clean air, consumer protections, net neutrality, and other issues. When it comes to workers' rights, Judge Kavanaugh has routinely sided with corporations who want to prevent workers from unionizing. Even at President Trump's own hotel in Atlantic City, which at the time had admitted its refusal to bargain with workers in a 2012 case. When the car dealers across several hotels voted to unionize, Judge Kavanaugh and a panel of judges invalidated the will of the workers, overturned an administrative law judge's ruling that the union be certified, and allowed the Trump Hotel to continue violating workers' rights. On environmental issues, Judge Kavanaugh's record shows that time and again he favors polluters over clean water and clean air. With his confirmation, it will be much harder for Americans to seek redress in the courts, and it will be easier for polluters to continue to pollute the environment. As a circuit court judge, he has written 10 dissenting opinions in environmental cases, and in each one, he argued against the side that sought to protect the public health and the environment. Mr. President, Judge Kavanaugh's sweeping view of executive power should cause alarm among every member of this Senate, Republican and Democrat alike. We've all heard the testimony, we've seen the writings, and it appears to be no surprise that President Trump, who is watching that Mueller investigation get closer and closer to his doorstep, that he would want a judge that gives excessive deference to the executive branch. Somebody who may be on the Supreme Court when that court has to decide whether or not President Trump can be subpoenaed in that case or otherwise brought to justice in that case, if that's what the conclusions demand. So, Mr. President, it's clear on all of these issues that President Trump and Republicans had their man in Judge Kavanaugh. They have someone who they believe will overturn the Affordable Care Act, once again giving insurance companies a green light to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. They think they've got someone who will overturn Roe v. Wade or dramatically limit a woman's right to reproductive freedom and choice. Someone who will gut environmental regulations, undermine workers' rights and consumer protections, and someone who will give corporations the ability to continue to spend unlimited amounts of money in elections, and who might even argue that the contribution limits to candidates are unconstitutional and can be limited. And finally, someone who the president believes will get him off the hook if the Mueller investigation gets too close to him. So, Mr. President, here we have Republicans in this Senate and a president on the verge of getting someone who they thought could do all those things. And then something unexpected happened. The country learned about what happened to Dr. Ford. Our Republican colleagues seem to have forgotten that Dr. Ford did not want to come forward publicly to report her sexual assault. It was only when she found out that Judge Kavanaugh was on the second short list that was released that she became concerned. Even then, she didn't want to come forward publicly, but she thought it was her civic duty to let people know what had happened to her. And so she reached out to her representative in Congress on a confidential basis. The story did become public, and when it did, she felt duty-bound to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee and tell senators what happened to her on that awful day. We all know she had nothing to gain. She has been subjected to all sorts of awful death threats and other kinds of verbal abuse. Nothing to gain, everything to lose. And our Republican senators who listened to her testimony, for the most part, said that her testimony was both powerful and credible. We know she answered questions directly. By contrast, Judge Kavanaugh's testimony was partisan, it was evasive, and on many points, even under oath, untruthful. When the female prosecutor that Republicans hired to ask questions for them could not discredit Dr. Ford's testimony, we saw many of our Republican colleagues launch into full partisan attack mode. No longer did the facts matter. They picked up on Judge Kavanaugh's opening statement about partisanship rather than seeking to get to the truth about what happened to Dr. Ford and others who have alleged sexual assault. What mattered was ramming through their nominee. The majority leader, Senator McConnell, said, quote, "They'll plow right through," unquote. And by God, nothing was going to stop them. They even scheduled the vote on Judge Kavanaugh before they had heard the testimony about sexual abuse and sexual assault from Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. It was only when Senator Flake recognized what a sham the process was that he at least forced the Republican leadership to do what they did not want to do and agree to a short FBI investigations into the allegations of Dr. Ford and Deborah Ramirez. But the goal never changed. The goal of ramming through the nomination never changed. And that's why Senate Republicans in the White House dramatically limited the scope of the FBI investigation. They tied the hands of the FBI. They told the FBI who they could interview. An investigation that was already going to be short at about a week was cut even shorter and was finished up in a matter of days. And what's the result, Mr. President? The result is completely predictable. The result is we have lots of key witnesses that say they have corroborating evidence to support the allegations of Dr. Ford and Deborah Ramirez who were not interviewed. And the country will continue to hear from these witnesses after today's vote because the investigation was orchestrated by the White House and the Senate Republican leadership. The FBI was not allowed to do its full job. Mr. President, it would have been better for all parties involved, and I mean all parties, including Judge Kavanaugh, to have had a thorough investigation where at the end of the day, the public could have confidence that all the available evidence had been tracked down and reviewed. That would have been best for the integrity of the court and the integrity of the Senate. And we all know there's no requirement that we rush this confirmation. We all know that. After all, it was the Republican leader who kept a seat open on the Supreme Court for months and months and months after President Obama had nominated Judge Merrick Garland. So this notion that there's some kind of artificial deadline is simply untrue. This is all being done to do, as the majority leader said, plow right through. Because taking time to do the investigation right would have put the entire enterprise at risk, the entire plan to put on the Supreme Court the person who President Trump and Republicans believe will deliver the legal outcomes they want. Even if all the testimony shows he can no longer be impartial, his record and testimony indicate that they will deliver the legal outcomes they want in this case. Now, Mr. President, Dr. Ford's courage in coming forward to tell us what happened to her has empowered many of my Maryland constituents and many others around the country to come forward with their own stories of abuse. I have received written statements from over 50 Marylanders telling me about the sexual abuse they had encountered. Some of them told me they had shared with me what they have not shared with their own family members. They felt it was important that I know why they did not report their abuse at the time, why they did not tell their parents, why their memories were not perfect decades later. They told me what they do remember. They told me they remember the clothing they wore the day they were assaulted. They tell me they remember the scent, the cologne, the feeling of unwanted hands. Those memories haunt them. These stories are reminders of how our society has let down survivors of sexual assault for decades. The way that these survivors have been treated has been shameful. I'm humbled by the trust they have shown to share these experiences with me, and I will let the stories of a few of them speak for themselves here on the floor of the Senate. Here's what one woman wrote, quote, "Once, when I was 16, I was at a party. There was alcohol. He was popular. I wasn't. He was big and strong. I have never been. He threatened me afterwards. He needn't have bothered. He told me no one would believe me. He told me I wanted it. I showed a friend the bruises. He said everyone would say I was a slut. I told another friend I was frightened. She said I should just avoid him in school. I told an adult I trusted at my job. She told me about how when she reported when she was young, how the police treated her, how her parents reacted, how she regretted saying anything. I never told my parents. I went to a free clinic, and the therapist asked, how could I know it was rape if I had been drinking? Those are the powerful words from one Marylander. Another wrote, quote, I remember the assault vividly. I was on my way home from church. I don't remember the sermon before. Details are fuzzy, but I remember the assault. I remember looking at a nearby home where I knew elderly people lived. I could see that their TV was on, and I wondered, would they even hear me scream? I didn't tell people. I didn't think people would believe me. End of quote. Another constituent wrote me this quickly, without editing. She told me she cried when she read it to her husband. Here's what she wrote, quote, having experience in working with victims in a prosecutorial manner or as a judge, or even defending the accused does not make you an expert. The expert is the victim. I am that victim. I am that expert. And as such, I can tell you absolutely, without hesitation, that what haunts you most, what affects how you relate in the future with your loving spouse, what affects how you feel about yourself, and what affects even your sense of smell, is the memory of the person who abused you. Not the address where it took place, not the time on the clock, not the day of the week, but the smell of the person assaulting you, the feel of their hands, the confusion in your head, because you don't know what's happening, because it's all happening so fast. And yes, their name. You never forget their name. She went on to say, quote, "Then comes the shame. What did I do to cause this? What will people think of me now because I've been touched? I've been tarnished. Will I be believed? At this point, my life has already been altered beyond repair, but it's an internal alter. If I talk, it alters my external world as well. Maybe it's better to just not talk, because then at least I can pretend things are as they have always been. I can just pretend that I'm exactly the same person, but I'm not." End of that passage. Another wrote that she understood that a man could move on from assaulting a woman, particularly if they were drunk at the time. She said, and I quote, "The man who assaulted me later acted as if he was catching up with an old friend and had no memory of the event. I have several friends who have experienced the same thing." End quote. Another echoed a similar experience, writing, quote, "He had been drinking heavily with friends at a restaurant or bar. I had not. Later that night, he raped me. He was very inebriated and displayed a complete personality change. He was violent and angry and did not even seem to see me. I was paralyzed and probably saved my own life by not fighting back, as he had essentially become a rabid animal. The next day, I confronted him about what had happened, and he had no memory of the crime he committed." End quote. Mr. President, these are not isolated incidents for survivors. As I said, I've gotten over 50 personal testimonials from survivors since Dr. Ford had the courage to come forward. People who have not shared what happened to them with some of their closest friends or family members. These are stains etched in their memories. Many of them, as I said, never told a soul. Others were ignored or dismissed when they brought these awful experiences up. They were told to stay quiet. Mr. President, it's an insult to these survivors when some have called them partisan. And in many cases, they went out of their way in their messages to me to say that their concern had nothing to do with ideology or partisanship. Nothing. Some told me they're Republicans. Others are independents. Some of them grew up at the time were in families that had no care about politics. Others told me they were Democrats, but they'd be more than willing to accept a different conservative judge, but not this one. Mr. President, when Donald Trump went to a campaign rally and mocked Dr. Ford, he mocked every one of those 50 survivors who wrote to me. He mocked every survivor of sexual abuse around the country. And this Senate's decision to do, as the majority leader said, quote, plow right through without undertaking a thorough and serious investigation into the charges from Dr. Ford, Deborah Ramirez, that also disrespects these survivors. That's what they say to me. And of course, Judge Kavanaugh did the same thing in his opening statement at his most recent hearing, because his entire opening statement suggested that Dr. Ford's coming forward was part of some political conspiracy. And unfortunately, that's where this conversation has gone ever since. not an effort to really get to the truth, to really get all the facts, but just to do what the majority leader said before she even testified: plow right through. Mr. President, we know that etched above the Supreme Court are the words "equal justice under law." It does not say plow right through. Mr. President, the decision to plow right through, will undermine and haunt the integrity of the Supreme Court for decades to come. And it will also haunt and undermine the integrity of this United States Senate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I have to say, I am sick of this. I am sick of everyone who wants to rewrite the history of what happened in the Senate with the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. It isn't even over yet, and they want people to believe that what we've witnessed over the past weeks was what they call a political hit job perpetrated by Democrats with a grudge. That's the story the nominee himself tried to sell in his testimony on Thursday. He accused Democrats of lying in wait. He twisted Ranking Member Feinstein's respect for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's wish for privacy. He falsely claimed that Democrats had her accusation ready, that Dr. Ford's accusation was held in secret for weeks because the Democrats, as Judge Kavanaugh put it, couldn't take me out on the merits. What a paranoid fantasy. Brett Kavanaugh's entire performance was an hours-long rant. I'm quoting him. He said, "This whole two-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups." End quote. Unbelievable, in my view. He claimed to have written the screed on his own without showing it to any of his handlers. I find that hard to believe, given that he was reported to have spent 10-hour days at the White House preparing for this hearing. We heard Dr. Ford's raw and sincere account of that night as a drunk teenage Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge attacked her. The nominee called it a grotesque and coordinated character assassination. But this isn't a conspiracy, Judge Kavanaugh. It's reality. Look at what Dr. Ford's coming forward has triggered. People believe her for many reasons. Her recall of the events is consistent with the way survivors of trauma remember things. Her demeanor was forthright and open. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain by coming forward. And despite what many are saying, there are quite a bit of collaboration of her story. She knew Brett Kavanaugh. She socialized with his circle of friends. She had told people in her life what happened to her long before Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the Supreme Court. His calendars attest to his having attended at least one gathering consistent with her recollection. But another reason so many people believe Dr. Ford is that her account is so familiar. It has echoes in so many of our own stories, our own experiences. So many women have survived some version of what happened to her, along a spectrum of experiences that range from creepy looks or catcalls to rape and other violent attacks. So many women have kept their stories to themselves for fear of not being believed, for fear of retaliation or humiliation or shunning. In a column written by Monica Hess in the Washington Post entitled, "Dear Dads, your daughters told me about their assaults. This is why they never told you." Ms. Hess writes about all the reasons why survivors don't even tell the people closest to them about what happened to them. She writes, quote, "For all the stereotypes that linger about women being too fragile or emotional, these past weeks have revealed what many women already know. A lot of effort goes into protecting men we love from bad things that happen to us," end quote. She writes to fathers who are only now finding out about the daily indignities women endure and explains why they were never told and why their loved ones were now writing to Hess herself. I am going to quote extensively from Ms. Hess's article. Quote, "To the father of the young woman who was assaulted by the student athlete she was hired to tutor, she never told you because she didn't want to break your heart, but she told me in a long email because the memory of it was breaking her own heart, and she spent 5 years replaying it. To the father of the junior high student who was pinned down and undressed at a gathering 30 years ago, she didn't tell you because she didn't want to see you cry, but she told me that she still remembers every detail. To the father of the teenager who was raped at a party, you don't know about this because she was certain that if you knew, you would kill her attacker and go to prison, and it would be her fault. To the father of the son who was assaulted by an older man, I wish I could tell you more about what happened to him, but he wouldn't tell me, and he definitely won't tell you because manliness is important to you," he says. To all the fathers of all the silent victims, your children are quietly carrying these stories, not because they can't handle the emotions, but because they are worried that you can't. They're worried that your emotions will have too many consequences, or they fear you won't think of them the same way, or that you'll be distraught because you didn't protect them, end quote. These words and stories are powerful, and Ms. Hess is right. So many survivors want to protect their loved ones, but Ms. Hess is also right that they shouldn't keep their stories in. She urges them, saying, and again I quote, "So to the rest of you, if you can tell your father in a way that feels safe, in a way that would bring you comfort, tell your father. Tell your brothers. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them share some of your pain. Don't let them be ignorant," end quote. And once women are able to share their experiences, what should we do with them? I agree with the author, Rebecca Traister, who captured so much of what I have been thinking lately in a piece called "Fury is a Political Weapon and Women Need to Wield It" in the New York Times. I want to read some of it to you. Ms. Traister wrote, quote, "Outside the room where Christine Blasey Ford was testifying on Thursday morning, women were incandescent with rage and sorrow and horror. They were getting angry in a new way, a public way, an unapologetic way, a way that is typically reserved for men and that would again serve men well when afternoon came. Brett Kavanaugh bellowed, he snarled, he pouted, and wept furiously at the injustice of having his ascendance to power interrupted by accusations of sexual assault. He challenged his questioners, turned their queries back on them. What happened inside the room was an exceptionally clear distillation of who has historically been allowed to be angry on their own behalf and who has not. And outside the room was a hint of how it might be changing. Most of the time, female anger is discouraged, repressed, ignored, swallowed, or transformed into something more palatable and less recognizable as fury, something like tears. When women are truly livid, they often weep. Maybe we cry when we're furious, in part because we feel a kind of grief of all the things we want to say or yell that we know we can't. Maybe we're just sad about the very same things that we're angry about. I wept as soon as Dr. Blasey began to speak. On social media, I saw hundreds of messages from women who reported the same experience of finding themselves awash in tears simply in response to this woman's voice raised in polite dissent. The power of the moment, the anxiety that it would be futile, the grief that we even had to put her and ourselves through this spectacle was intense. Tears are permitted as an outlet for wrath, in part because they are fundamentally misunderstood. One of my sharpest memories from an early job in a male-dominated office, where I once found myself weeping with an inexpressible rage, was my being grabbed by the scruff of my neck by an older woman, a chilly manager of whom I'd always been slightly terrified, who dragged me into a stairwell. "Never let them see you crying," she told me. "They don't know you're furious. They think you're sad and will be pleased because they got to you." This political moment has provoked a period in which more and more women have been in no mood to dress their fury up as anything other than raw and burning rage. Many women are yelling, shouting, using Sharpies to etch sharply worded slogans onto protest signs, making furious phone calls to representatives. Many of the women shouting now are women who have not previously yelled publicly before. Many of them white middle-class women newly awakened to political fury and protest. Part of the process of becoming mad must be recognizing that they are not the first to be furious and that there is much to learn from the stories and histories of the livid women, many of them not white or middle class, who have never had reason not to be mad. If you are angry today, or if you have been angry for a while, and you're wondering whether you're allowed to be as angry as you feel, let me say, yes, you are allowed. You are, in fact, compelled. If you've been feeling a new rage at the flaws of this country, and if your anger is making you want to change your life in order to change the world, then I have something incredibly important to say. Don't forget how this feels, end quote. That's Rebecca Traister's article. Traister ends her article by endorsing anger and telling women not to let go of it. She says, what you're angry about now, injustice, will still exist, even if you yourself are not experiencing it or are tempted to stop thinking about how you experience it and how you contribute to it. Others are still experiencing it, still mad. Some of them are mad at you. Don't forget them. Don't write off their anger. Stay mad for them, alongside them. Let them lead you in anger, end quote. That's what I am left with, Mr. President. Anger, fury, disgust at a process that could not see the truth of what Dr. Ford tried to tell us. The rewriters of truth are already at it, in column after column, on cable's news shows across the country. Even here on the Senate floor, they are casting Judge Kavanaugh as the victim. I was asked a few days ago whether the 4 Democratic women on the Judiciary Committee had a special responsibility to address the question of sexual assault. I reject the premise of that question. It's not just up to the women in this country to stand up. Men have to join us. They have to hold themselves and other men accountable. They have to push back against the fear that those with power feel when they are challenged. And we saw some of the ways that this kind of fear operates just this week among some of my Senate colleagues. When approached by survivors of sexual assault who waited to talk to them about the Kavanaugh nomination, they said things like, grow up, and insinuating that the women sharing their painful, traumatic accounts were there to enjoy themselves. Enjoy themselves? We saw the President of the United States sink to a level I didn't think possible. The mocker-in-chief mocked Dr. Ford, a survivor of sexual assault. He mocked her for not remembering some peripheral things about the attack. But the thing she said she was 100% sure of was that it was Brett Kavanaugh who attacked her. In case some of my colleagues don't get it, sexual assault survivors often don't remember how many steps, how many rooms, the kinds of things the president mocked Dr. Ford about. But they remember the attack itself with 100% accuracy. They remember how it felt, the fear, the laughter of the attackers. The kinds of insults that have been hurled at Dr. Ford and others in her situation are cruel and unnecessary. Mr. President, I'm left with anger and determination, just like millions of people across the country. I will take Rebecca Tracer's advice and commend it to the women of America and the men who understand their stories. I will stay mad and let that anger propel us to change. Going forward, I will continue to listen to women who have shared their stories. I will tell them I hear them, that I see them, and that I want all of us to be the change that needs to happen in our country. Mr. President, before I yield the floor, I want to read a statement from Debbie Ramirez, dated October 6, 2018, and she says, 35 years ago, the other students in the room chose to laugh and look the other way as sexual violence was perpetuated on me by Brett Kavanaugh. As I watch many of the senators speak and vote on the floor of the Senate, I feel like I'm right back at Yale, where half the room is laughing and looking the other way. Only this time, instead of drunk college kids, it is U.S. senators who are deliberately ignoring his behavior. This is how victims are isolated and silenced. But I do have corroborating witnesses speaking for me, although they were not allowed to speak to the FBI, and I feel extremely grateful for them and for the overwhelming amount of support that I have received and continue to receive during this extremely difficult and painful time. There may be people with power who are looking the other way, but there are millions more who are standing together, speaking up about personal experiences of sexual violence and taking action to support survivors. This is truly a collective moment of survivors and allies standing together. Thank you for hearing me, seeing me, and believing me. I am grateful for each and every one of you. We will not be silenced. We stand in truth and light. Debbie Ramirez. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, one, I thank the distinguished senator from Hawaii for her comments. She has had a strong voice of reason and conscience throughout this whole debate. President, this is not a normal confirmation vote. I've now served in the Senate for 19 Supreme Court nominations, more than any other senator. I've never seen so much at stake with a single seat. And I've never seen this much at stake precisely because this is about more than one seat. Indeed, the integrity of two of the three co-equal branches of our republic is at stake. This vote will decide whether the United States Senate, which at its best can serve as the conscience of the nation, causes the Supreme Court to be indelibly tainted in the eyes of millions of Americans, perhaps more than half the country. And to be clear, my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh is not because he was nominated by a Republican president. In my 44 years in the Senate, I have voted for more Republican-appointed judges than almost every single Republican senator serving today. And that includes, of course, voting to confirm Chief Justice John Roberts. But Judge Kavanaugh is not a typical conservative nominee. My opposition is driven by my firm belief that his confirmation would bring great harm to the court and to this body and to millions of hardworking Americans. Judge Kavanaugh has been relentlessly dishonest under oath. I'm not just referring to the fact that he's not telling the truth about his high school drinking or the obvious misogyny in his yearbook, or whether he's Bartle Kavanaugh who passed out from drunkenness. All of that, of course, does speak to his credibility, as he concocted far-fetched story after far-fetched story, all to avoid conceding facts that would corroborate the Brett Kavanaugh as described by Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez. But it's much more than that, much, much more than that. Every single time Judge Kavanaugh has testified before the Senate, in 2004, in 2006, twice in 2018, he's misled, he's dissembled. On issues both big and small, anytime he's been faced with questions that are incriminating or place him in the middle of a controversy, he's shown he cannot be trusted to tell the truth. He misled the Senate following questions by both Republicans and Democrats. He misled the Senate about his role in a hacking scandal and thefts from the United States Senate. He misled the Senate about his role in confirming several controversial judicial nominees, and in shaping the legal justifications for some of the Bush administration's most extreme and eventually discredited policies. I've never seen a nominee so casually willing to evade and deny the truth in service of his own raw ambition. For decades, that ambition has led him step after step evade the truth if it's in any way going to stop his ambitions. And the truth is, we're just beginning to learn about Judge Kavanaugh's dishonesty under oath. His false testimony during his 2004 and 2006 confirmation hearings only came to light as the Judiciary Committee obtained some of his White House emails. Some, because Senate Republicans blocked access to 90% of his White House record. I compare that to when Justice Kagan was here. We made sure the Republicans and Democrats had 99% of her record and briefed on the remaining 1%. Here, 90% was blocked. So everything we've learned about his prior dishonesty comes from just 10% of his record. Now, many more of these records are eventually going to become public after today. In fact, I joined a lawsuit led by Senator Blumenthal to force the National Archives to release these records. So if 10% of his records show dishonesty, what are the chances that the other 90% do not contain additional evidence of Judge Kavanaugh's dishonesty under oath? I'd say the chance is about zero. And it's not just Judge Kavanaugh's veracity that's disqualifying. It's also his temperament, his partisan zeal. When Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 2004, he was known only as a hyper-partisan political operative. Because he was seen as so hyper-political, it took 2 years to get him confirmed. And since Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court, I'd wondered whether his earlier partisan zeal that held him up for 2 years whether that has remained. Well, it was confirmed last week that it does remain. I have never seen a nominee of either Republican or Democrat so consumed by partisan rancor. In testimony that veered into a tirade, he angrily attacked senators, dismissed Dr. Ford's testimony as part of a smear campaign to ruin his name and sink his nomination. His conspiratorial ramblings, attributing the allegations to revenge on behalf of the Clintons, wherever that came from, were an insult to Dr. Ford and to survivors of sexual violence everywhere. And it's not helped that his patron, the President of the United States, continues to deride victims of sexual violence. Former Justice John Paul Stevens, a Republican appointee, actually the first nominee I was able to vote on as a United States Senator, and I voted for him. This Republican appointee, well-respected Supreme Court Justice, declared that Judge Kavanaugh's unhinged performance last week demonstrates potential bias. Justice Stevens said that for the good of the court, Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation ought not to proceed. Just yesterday, contrary to the statements made on the floor of the Senate, the American Bar Association announced that it's reopening its evaluation of Judge Kavanaugh's fitness to serve as a judge. These developments, both unprecedented, should serve as a flashing red warning sign to any senator inclined to vote yes at this time. And there are more flashing red signs. Dr. Ford's credible and compelling testimony captivated the nation, inspired survivors of sexual violence across the country. Every minute of her testimony was credible. She disclosed the abuse long before Judge Kavanaugh was a household name. She remembered vivid details of that night. She expressed 100% certainty that Judge Kavanaugh was her abuser. In a moment that I'll never forget, when I asked her, "Doctor, what is your strongest memory?" Something from the incident she could not forget. She testified, "Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two as a teenage Brett Kavanaugh and a friend drunkenly assaulted Dr. Ford." Dr. Ford had nothing to gain by coming forward. I believe her just as I believed Anita Hill. In my view, no one who truly believes Dr. Ford can credibly justify voting yes. But unfortunately, the Senate appears to be on the brink of failing Dr. Ford, just as it will fail Ms. Ramirez, and just as it failed Anita Hill. The FBI investigation completed over the last few days falls short of any standard. And it fell short by design. We've already heard about the deficiencies from Dr. Ford, Ms. Ramirez, and numerous other witnesses who attempted unsuccessfully to share relevant information with the FBI. But the FBI were told by the Senate Republican leadership in the White House that this should not be a full investigation. The Senate Republican leadership in the White House did everything in their power to ensure that this investigation was not a search for truth, but rather a search for cover. Even a basic search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to interview Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, as well as her husband and her therapist. A search for truth would have allowed the FBI to interview numerous high school and college classmates who come forward saying they could provide information about Judge Kavanaugh's conduct during those years that was consistent with the allegations. A search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to interview a man who wrote a sworn statement asserting that he could corroborate Ms. Ramirez's allegations, or two women who contacted authorities with evidence that Judge Kavanaugh tried to head off Ms. Ramirez's story before it became public. That was in clear contradiction with his testimony before the Judiciary Committee. A search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to at least speak with Julie Swetnick, a third accuser. As Vermonters said to me last weekend when I was home, if they have nothing to hide, why the rush? They have nothing to hide. Why don't they take the time to find the whole truth? But instead of calling on the FBI to take these basic investigatory steps, inexplicably, the Republican-controlled Judiciary Committee has solely tried to discredit these women. The committee released a statement from a former acquaintance of Ms. Swetnick. This individual had no knowledge of the alleged incident, but instead wanted to describe the alleged sexual preferences of Ms. Swetnick. According to the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, one of the most nonpartisan and respected voices on Capitol Hill, the shameless attempt to smear a victim violates the intent of the Rape Shield law. Look what happened. On the one hand, you have the President of the United States at a rally trying to shame the victim, who of course is a woman. And then we have, on the other hand, Ms. Swetnick was never even interviewed by the FBI. She was ignored. She was silenced. And then, to follow the routine of this administration, she was shamed. It's outrageous she's been treated that way. Republicans have also claimed that the other individuals Dr. Ford identified at the gathering where she was assaulted have refuted her testimony. These Republicans know that's just false. Those individuals stated publicly they do not recall the event. As Dr. Ford told the Judiciary Committee, this is not surprising. It's a very unremarkable party because nothing remarkable happened to them that evening. But one of these individuals has said publicly she believes Dr. Ford. Republicans have claimed the investigation failed to reveal corroborating evidence for any of these allegations. But despite the numerous restrictions placed on this investigation, that simply is not true. But a predicate fact for developing thorough corroborating evidence is a thorough investigation. And this investigation fell far short. When I was a prosecutor, I never would have allowed an investigation that left out so many salient points. It's a disservice to Dr. Ford, to Ms. Ramirez, to Ms. Swetnick, but it's a disservice to survivors everywhere. The manic rush to place Judge Kavanaugh on the bench was more important to many in the Senate than these women. Pushing toward confirmation while so many leads remain unexamined is forever going to taint Justice Kavanaugh and unfortunately the Supreme Court itself. Yes, truth can be dogged. It has a way of coming out eventually. And for any senator who votes yes, while troubling new developments in this nominee are occurring in real time, it's going to be on their conscience when more disqualifying information later emerges, and it will. I urge them to think carefully about what a yes vote would mean to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, to the integrity of the Senate, to the increasing divisiveness in our nation. As partisan as this process has been, this is not a partisan dilemma. Many prominent conservatives would make a fine Supreme Court justice. And as I said at the beginning of my speech, I voted for more Republican nominees than almost any Republican senator in this body. But these other people would not cast a shadow over the Supreme Court and a shadow over the United States Senate along with it. Judge Kavanaugh is not that choice. To avoid risking permanent damage to the integrity of our institutions of government, I urge senators, join me in voting no on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We come together today to talk about a critical nomination to the United States Supreme Court at a time when the court will be considering a range of issues that are critically important to the American people. Right now, one of the issues that a lot of Americans are most concerned about is the issue of health care. So many aspects to that issue that we can examine today. I'll get to larger overriding concerns I have with the nomination in a moment, but for now, what I'll do is walk through some concerns I have when it comes to health care itself, and in particular, Americans with disabilities. Because I think this part of the debate, in this part of Judge Kavanaugh's record, and the potential impact that his decisions as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court could have on health care itself and people with disabilities, this whole part of his record and what might happen has been maybe not unexamined, but not examined enough in this debate. I'll start with health care. If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed today, he could be the deciding vote in eliminating key health care protections for people with pre-existing conditions, an action that would have serious repercussions on the health care of millions of Americans. This administration and congressional Republicans have been trying for the better part of the last 2 years to rip away health care coverage from the people who need it the most across America. Republicans in both branches of government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, have attempted to decimate Medicaid, and although they've been unable so far to fully repeal the Affordable Care Act here in Congress, the Republicans have turned to the courts to sabotage the health care system and the Affordable Care Act. And by the way, while we're mentioning the Medicaid program, let's remind the American people what that program is. The Medicaid program is not a them program, it's an us program. It's about us, who we are as Americans, whether or not we're going to take care of the family of America. And I think my home state is representative of the impact that Medicaid has on people across the country. 40% of the children in Pennsylvania get their health care through the Medicaid program. 50% of the people with disabilities in Pennsylvania rely upon Medicaid. And 60% of seniors trying to get into a nursing home for long-term care in the twilight of their lives rely upon the Medicaid program. 40% of the kids, 50% of people with disabilities, and 60% of seniors rely upon this program. Some 70 million Americans. So the decisions by this Congress or this body and the entire legislative branch are critically important on Medicaid and health care. Obviously, the decisions of the executive branch, but now we have to focus as well on the judicial branch, especially with a nomination that could tip the balance in 5-4 decisions. Judge Kavanaugh has twice disagreed with rulings upholding the Affordable Care Act. It's no coincidence he's been nominated by this president, by this administration. President Trump apparently believes he can count on Justice Kavanaugh, were he to be confirmed, to rule against the Affordable Care Act when he is on the Supreme Court, if he were to be confirmed today. And you don't take my word for this. A former law clerk of Judge Kavanaugh said it best when she spoke about Judge Kavanaugh's view of the Affordable Care Act. Quote, this is from a law clerk, "No other contender on President Trump's list is on record so vigorously opposing the law," unquote. The law meaning the Affordable Care Act that brought health care to 20 million Americans, about more than half of them because we expanded Medicaid. Right now, courts are considering whether people with pre-existing conditions should continue to be protected from being charged more, from being denied coverage, or being dropped from their insurance simply because of their health status. Who would ever believe that after putting into law, enacting into law those protections for 130 million Americans, who would ever believe we'd still be debating it? And then an entire political party would be in a court of law arguing that those protections are unconstitutional. It's an insult to who we are as Americans. In Texas versus the United States, the administration has sided with 20 Republican state attorneys general and is refusing to defend the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions. So what's at stake in this legal battle that could end up, obviously, down the road in the Supreme Court? It is 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions. And that means people with diabetes or cancer or anything else that's a pre-existing condition could have their lives grossly, adversely impacted. The Supreme Court might be the last line of defense to maintaining those protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And a Justice Kavanaugh could be the deciding vote to rip away protections which are in law now, right now, and they could be taken away. If Republicans were to win this fight, coverage for millions of Americans who have these protections would be adversely impacted. That's probably an understatement. We also have to be concerned about the fundamentals of our health insurance system, the fundamental stability of our healthcare system, which could be undermined or worse. Such a decision by the Supreme Court would have real-life consequences. In Pennsylvania alone, 5.3 million people, including 643,000 children, have a pre-existing condition. I'll tell you the story of one of those children, Jackson Corbin, 13 years old, Hanover, Pennsylvania. He lives with his mother, Anna, his father, Michael, and his brother, Henry. Jackson, Henry, and their mom all have Noonan syndrome, a congenital disability that often involves heart attacks, bleeding problems, possible developmental delays, short stature, and malformation of the rib cage. All of that in the life of one child. Jackson's most troubling concern is a form of hemophilia called von Willebrand disease. And because of this disease, he has to be very careful not to cut himself or to do things that might cause internal bleeding. This means that Jackson cannot play sports, he cannot roller skate or even jump on a trampoline. The cost of his health care, including medications and treatments and specialists, is more than what his parents would make in a year. In a year. Without health insurance coverage that they are able to purchase through the Affordable Care Act, including protections for pre-existing conditions, the Corbin family would either go bankrupt or Jackson and his mother and his brother would have to go without treatment, of course, risking their lives. Last month, Jackson testified in front of the Judiciary Committee and spoke about what Judge Kavanaugh's nomination meant for him, for Jackson Corbin. Quote, "My Noonan syndrome is part of who I am. It's been a part of me since the day I was born and will be a part of me for the rest of my life. If you destroy protections for pre-existing conditions, you will leave me and all the kids and adults like me without care and without the ability to afford our care, all because of who we are," unquote. Let me repeat those last few words of Jackson Corbin, 13 years old. Quote, "Without care or without the ability to afford our care," unquote. That's what we're talking about here. Judge Kavanaugh could very well be the deciding vote in determining the future of this child and the future of members of his family. all of us, everybody in this building today, are just one illness. Each of us is just one injury away from having our own pre-existing condition, if we don't have one already. Maybe senators and judges and justices don't have to worry about protections for pre-existing conditions. Maybe they can all buy that protection one way or another. But 130 million Americans have to worry, and have to worry about this consequential nomination on an issue of such grave importance as health care itself, and maybe most especially protections for people with pre-existing conditions. How about disabilities? Judge Kavanaugh's record on the rights of individuals with disabilities is troubling as well. I'll give you one example. Liz Weintraub, who, like Jackson, testified in front of the Judiciary Committee in opposition to Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. I know Liz Weintraub well. She's 51 years old. She's from Rockville, Maryland. She has cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. She has had 2 loving parents and 3 loving sisters. And for 4 months this year, she was on my staff as a legislative fellow. So I'm not objective when it comes to Liz Weintraub. But here's what she told us. And the work she did, of course, on our staff was significant. She helped organize hearings and worked on disability issues to educate our office and me, as well as other Senate offices, about the importance of hiring people with disabilities. But Liz experienced low expectations in her life. She was told by educators she could never attend college. She spent 9 years in a private institution. She was told she had to work in a sheltered workshop. Despite these barriers, Liz persevered and achieved her dream of being a disability policy advocate. Her knowledge, experience, and wisdom made my office a better place on these issues and a better place to work. It strengthened our office's ability to work on disability policy. Let's get to the judge's record on these issues. Judge Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit shows a pattern of siding against individuals with disabilities. He has sided with employers over employees who have a disability, making it more difficult for employers to prove discrimination in court and have their rights protected under the law. And in a case called Doe versus D.C., he called into question the very autonomy and right to self-determination of people with disabilities. The case involved 3 women who had intellectual disabilities and lived in facilities run by the District of Columbia. The district allowed medical professionals to decide when elective surgeries would be performed on these women without even consulting with them and without even trying to determine the wishes of these 3 women. The trial court sided with the women in this case and said that the District of Columbia had to attempt to determine what these women wanted before making medical decisions on their behalf. Judge Kavanaugh overturned the lower court decision. He questioned the basic liberty of individuals with disabilities. He allowed the government to continue making medical decisions on their behalf, these 3 women in the District of Columbia, without ever attempting to determine what they wanted. This decision is offensive to the American people, but it's offensive, I think, to people with disabilities even more so. People who have fought for decades to secure the rights of people with disabilities. The decision robbed these women of their autonomy, and it robbed them of their humanity. As Liz Weintraub said in her testimony, I worry that if a justice on the Supreme Court does not believe that we, as people with intellectual disabilities, can make decisions for ourselves, then we will have the right to make those decisions taken away from us. Quote, that is why I'm opposing Judge Kavanaugh, unquote. These are the words of Liz Weintraub speaking for many Americans with disabilities. I want to thank Liz for her testimony and for coming forward to speak on behalf of those Americans. These decisions about these rights for people with disabilities don't just impact the individuals in the particular lawsuit, they also set a precedent for future cases and send a message about the values of our country, about whose rights we consider worthy of protection. If our courts don't protect the rights and dignity of people with disabilities, then what are our courts there for? We have to ask that question. Mr. President, I want to conclude with just a couple of more comments. There's been a lot of debate and a lot of commentary and a lot of vigorous disagreement about the back and forth that occurred just last week. But I think I'm like many Americans who say I believe Dr. Ford's testimony. I thought she was both credible and persuasive. And I wrote the following earlier this week in an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer dated October 2nd, quote, in describing part of her testimony, the details of a sexual assault she experienced as a 15-year-old, that made an impression on Americans, of course. And then I went on to say the terror she felt in that moment, the horror of the physical assault, and the psychological trauma of believing she might die, unquote. I believe that testimony, and that alone is troubling enough when it comes to making a determination on this nomination. I was further concerned when I listened to the testimony of Judge Kavanaugh, concerned about his lack of judicial temperament. I think that's an understatement in that moment. And also whether or not he could be an impartial justice based upon what he said in response to the allegations, and especially what he was saying about Democrats in the Senate. So I will vote no for several reasons, many of them outlined with regard to health care and disability policy. I will vote no on this nomination, and I urge my colleagues to vote no as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, in a few moments, we will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. It is time. Justice Gorsuch and Justice Sotomayor were confirmed 66 days after they were nominated. Today marks the 90th day since President Trump nominated Judge Kavanaugh. So this is in line with the time frame for previous justices. What is different, though, about this nomination is the manifest unfairness in the way it was conducted and in the tone and behavior of some senators, as well as the special interest groups that support them. This institution used to be known as the world's greatest deliberative body, but you wouldn't know it now on this nomination. The senator from Maine said yesterday that we have hit rock bottom when it comes to the judicial confirmation process, and sadly, I agree. This, despite the heroic efforts of Senator Grassley, who along with his staff have been magnificent as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. What precipitated this embarrassing period for the Senate was the intentional and deliberate withholding of Dr. Ford's allegations from the Judiciary Committee and Judge Kavanaugh until the 11th hour, and then publicly ambushing everyone else concerned. It has been a process that, in words that echo from another dark period for the Senate, the McCarthy hearings, it has been cruel, reckless, and indecent, both to Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. Still, despite these hijinks and the weaponization of the confirmation process, we've bent over backwards to try to accommodate Dr. Ford once she said she wanted to come before the committee. We know she requested confidentiality as her allegations were investigated. She did not consent to nor authorize the release of her letter. She didn't want a public spectacle. Judiciary Committee staff even offered to fly to California on a bipartisan basis and interview her confidentially. But this offer was not even shared with her by her partisan lawyers. In other words, she said she never understood that offer was on the table. She thought the only way she could tell her story is in the midst of the three-ring circus that hearing became. But after Dr. Ford, the damage to her was done, When her identity became known, we invited Dr. Ford to testify. She came and did so, and I respect and admire her courage. It could not have been easy. We listened respectfully to her story. We took it very seriously. We treated her the same way we would want our wives or daughters to be treated. And we tried to learn the facts, cold, hard facts, as elicited by an expert in dealing with sexual assault cases. We all know that after the hearing, what that attorney told us, because it became public. She said as a prosecutor, she would never recommend charges under these circumstances because, in her view, there was no corroboration of Dr. Ford's account. And there were inconsistencies in her story regarding the place, the time, and the people involved in relevant events. In other words, this was not a case of he said, she said. It was a case of she said, they said, including everyone Dr. Ford claimed was a witness. Not only no corroboration, the alleged witnesses refuted her claim, including her best friend, Leland Kaiser, who said she never met Brett Kavanaugh. Then, even after all of that, even after hiding information that should have been shared confidentially with the Judiciary Committee, even after the outrageous conduct by some senators at the first hearing, intentionally violating committee rules and seeking delay after delay, even after that, we took another additional step to address any lingering concerns. The FBI launched a supplemental background investigation. There are two words to note about this investigation: supplemental and independent. Supplemental because Judge Kavanaugh has had 6 other previous background investigations. This was the 7th. Independent because now opponents are saying that, well, the investigation was merely checking a box. It wasn't thorough or comprehensive enough. But that simply doesn't jibe with the facts. The FBI was told to investigate current credible allegations, and they had a free rein to contact anyone they wanted. And they contacted many of the people that our Democratic colleagues, Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez themselves, said were eyewitnesses or persons with relevant knowledge. I'm talking about folks like Mark Judge and others. So opponents are trying to have it both ways: demand an investigation, but then badmouth it when it doesn't reveal what they hoped it would. Politics should not have and didn't dictate the terms of this supplemental background investigation. The FBI knows how to do its work, and now opponents of this nomination should accept its findings. But, Mr. President, this has never been a search for the truth by senators who had already announced their opposition to this nomination, some of them even before Judge Kavanaugh was named. Rather, it has become a matter of delay, defeat, and destroy. I do believe the senator from Arizona and others who joined in his request did us a great favor by insisting on the FBI supplemental background investigation. The American people can feel better that leads have been followed and exhausted for those still interested in a search for the facts. The American people now know that we took it upon ourselves to take one last step to dispel the doubts about Judge Kavanaugh's fitness to serve on the highest court in the land. And that step is now complete. So to Senators Flake, Collins, and others who requested that supplemental background investigation, I say thank you. Both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh have been badly treated throughout this process. Dr. Ford has been treated less as a real person than as a poker chip in a card game. Her wishes for confidentiality were ignored, her letter was leaked, and her story was weaponized in a political ambush. This whole charade, sad charade, has likewise been unfair to Judge Kavanaugh. These allegations could and should have been investigated by the committee under normal procedures and timelines designed to protect both the accuser and the accused. Instead, we got mob rule. Some blame Judge Kavanaugh for his righteous indignation and impassioned defense at a second hearing. But as somebody who served for 13 years on the bench myself, I know the difference between deciding a case as a judge, for which Judge Kavanaugh's temperament has been universally praised, and defending oneself against character assassination and personal destruction. Judge Kavanaugh understands the difference, too, and I have no doubt whatsoever about his judicial temperament. But imagine what this has been like for Judge Kavanaugh's parents, for his wife, for his children, for the friends and colleagues who know the real Brett Kavanaugh. Shocking or embarrassing doesn't begin to describe it. I am disappointed, more than I can say, at those who have unleashed these unjustified attacks on the judge and his family, and disappointed in their lack of any empathy or remorse for what they have put them through. No empathy, no remorse, none. For some of them, it seems that the end justifies the means. Chew good people up, spit them out, no problem, all in a day's work. After the dust settles on this dark period, we need to think about the damage all of this has done to the Senate as an institution and to the judicial confirmation process that we most certainly will embark upon again in the near future. It is my hope, it is my prayer that the politics of personal destruction simply because you don't agree with the nominee's judicial philosophy or the president that nominated him or her will stop. The low road is not available to us anymore because there is no lower road than the one we have been on. It's my hope that some of the tactics we've seen, intimidation, bullying, violating the rules, taunting members, trying to coerce them through bribes, carpet bombing them with TV ads, sending them coat hangers in the mail, screaming at them in the hallway. These cannot become the new normal. And so we cannot reward those tactics. I guarantee that if these tactics had succeeded in blocking Judge Kavanaugh, they would become the new normal. And that ought to chasten all of us. I hope we've learned a painful lesson these last few weeks and will strive to do better. I pledge my good faith and best efforts to do so, to try to help. We should recall the not-so-distant past when Ruth Ginsburg, the former general counsel of the American Civil Liberties Union, was confirmed by a vote of 96-3, when Justice Scalia was confirmed by a vote of 98-0, and John Paul Stevens confirmed by a vote of 98-0 as well. In a rational, logical world, Judge Kavanaugh should have similarly lopsided numbers. That is, if people were willing to get past their tribalism and look at our nominee's record, look at the more than 300 opinions he's authored, the decisions he's authored that the Supreme Court has unanimously embraced. If they would look at his scholarship, talk to his former colleagues and law clerks. If opponents were willing to do that honestly and thoroughly, they would have found a brilliant individual who cuts no corners in his legal analysis, who lets the chips fall where they may, and respects the very important but limited role of the judiciary in our constitutional system. In my view, a vote against Judge Kavanaugh is an endorsement of the way the opponents have mishandled and abused the confirmation process, as well as the shameful intimidation tactics they've employed. A no vote neglects all that the man is and all that he has accomplished based on unproven accusations about adolescent conduct. It justifies the manipulation and mistreatment of people like Dr. Ford for political gain. It would establish a dangerous precedent and legitimize mob rule, including the presumption of guilt in violation of everything our Constitution.
Has restored order to the galleries. The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, it would establish a dangerous precedent.
Suspend. As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, it would establish a dangerous precedent and legitimize mob rule, including the presumption of guilt in violation of everything our Constitution and fundamental notions of fairness stand for. Some say we are a nation divided, but I'm not so pessimistic as some. I actually hope we can all learn. We must learn, I believe, from this cruel, reckless, and indecent episode. But a no vote will not unite us. It will help reward despicable tactics and set a new ugly precedent. It will only encourage the spurning of tradition and the flouting of agreed upon rules, norms, and process. We should not ignore, we cannot acquiesce in or condone what has happened here. We should send a message loud and clear that the United States Senate will not be intimidated. I will cast my vote in favor of Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court of the United States, and I hope my colleagues will join me.
Senator will suspend until the Sergeant at Arms will restore order to the galleries. Sergeant at Arms will restore order to the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order to the galleries. As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me say at the outset that I'd like to set the record straight on the question of the FBI interview, which has been raised repeatedly by members on the other side of the aisle. It was our request from the start when we heard the complaints of Dr. Ford, her allegations, that there be a thorough FBI investigation. On the Democratic side, we asked for that repeatedly from the Republican majority. It wasn't until Senator Flake and some of his Republican colleagues made a point of saying they wouldn't move to go forward with this hearing without an FBI investigation that it finally was agreed to. Let me also add that statements have been made publicly by the public spokesman at the White House about how the witnesses were chosen for this FBI investigation. According to Mr. Shah, who works in the White House, he told us that a list of witnesses was sent by Senate Republicans to the White House, and they were included in their request. That is not the investigation we were looking for. We were hoping the FBI would revert to its professional status and to interview all of the witnesses who are relevant. Certainly among those relevant witnesses would have been Dr. Ford herself, who could have been questioned under penalty of criminal prosecution if she misled or lied to the FBI, who could have provided substantial corroborative information. She was never called on. Neither was Judge Kavanaugh by the FBI. Dr. Ford provided 8 different witnesses that she thought should be called to back up her side of the story. Not a single one of them was called by the FBI. Ms. Ramirez suggested 20 witnesses be called by the FBI on her behalf. Not one of them was called. This was not the FBI investigation which we sought, nor does it clear the charges against Judge Kavanaugh that were raised by Dr. Ford based on the fact that it was a scant interview that involved some 10 witnesses in a matter of just a few days with a limited roster of people who were going to be questioned. Let me speak to the matter at hand in a larger context. I've been in public life for a few years, but I've never seen the public reaction to this particular nomination and the hearings leading up to it that I've seen in this case. I went back to Illinois last week on Friday. Before I could get off the airplane at Midway Airport, people were talking to me, just passengers at random, about what had happened the day before when Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh testified before our committee. The same thing happened with cab drivers, the doorman at the hotel holding an umbrella in the rain and talking to me about the testimony that was given to the Judiciary Committee. For the next 3 days, everywhere I turned, every person had a comment to make. America was tuned in and watching carefully because they knew how important this hearing was. It wasn't just the nomination for someone to serve on the Supreme Court. It was critically important to Americans to know who would be that person, what their views were when it came to the health of women, the protection of our health insurance, our privacy, our right to vote. And it also was very clear that we held this hearing in the context of a national debate on sexual harassment and sexual violence. Is it any surprise that this explosive issue, which has touched corporate boardrooms, our churches, sports, Congress, has now been raised in our debate over a nomination to our highest court? And I ask my colleagues, is there a single one of us in the last 2 weeks who has not had an experience with someone coming forward, either in writing or in person, to tell you of their experience when it came to sexual harassment and sexual violence? Just a few minutes ago, I read the latest letters we've received in our office, 2 women from my state of Illinois who told me in their letters they were saying for the first time what actually had happened to them many, many years ago, and how much they identified with Dr. Ford and what she had gone through. That is a fact of life. The fact that this touched a nerve to so many Americans, and particularly to women who have gone through this experience, should put this whole debate in context. It should not be cheapened or lessened by political charges. We ought to understand the gravity of this debate in light of the cultural change we are now facing in America. This afternoon, we've reached the day of reckoning. Those of us who count votes for a living know how this will end. But I want to make it clear there's something we need to remember. One of the closest votes in the history of the Supreme Court will occur this afternoon with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. You have to go back 137 years in American history to find a closer vote for a Supreme Court justice. That tells you the seriousness with which this matter has been considered and undertaken by members of the Senate, and how divided we are on this nomination. But I want to ask my colleagues not just to reflect on this afternoon, but to reflect on tomorrow. What about the future of this Supreme Court, this important, critical institution in our Constitution? 6 years ago, in the days before the NFIB versus Sebelius decision, deciding the fate of the Affordable Care Act, a Pew Research poll found that public approval of the Supreme Court had reached an all-time low. Citizens United and Bush versus Gore had branded the Supreme Court as a political tool in the eyes of most Americans. Chief Justice Roberts stepped in and wrote a decision in that case which infuriated conservatives, but brought momentary credibility to the court. Filling this critical Kennedy vacancy with Judge Kavanaugh will again raise the question about Supreme Court politics. Chief Justice Roberts, are you watching? And what can we expect from this newest member of the court, Brett Kavanaugh? After his contentious nomination process, Clarence Thomas gave us 10 years of brooding silence on the bench of the Supreme Court. What can we expect from this new justice? Will he be the soup kitchen volunteer or the Federalist Society favorite? Will he be the man who raged at the Clintons and promised revenge for his ordeal, or the judge who impressed Senator Collins as more moderate than most of us on this side of the aisle ever found him? Will he be a justice forever grateful to President Trump who nominated him, or a justice who honors the rule of law more than any political leader or political party? And what about this Senate? What should the next Supreme Court vacancy look like? Will we continue to follow the Merrick Garland, plow it through playbook of judicial appointments at any cost, freezing out a nominee to the Supreme Court for almost 1 year, abandoning the blue slip process in the Senate Judiciary Committee, ignoring American Bar Association ratings, overturning rules protecting debate, concealing documents, tweeting confidential reports? when we sweep aside all the rules and traditions of the Senate Judiciary Committee just to pile up more and more Republican appointments to the court, what is left? Thomas More, in A Man for All Seasons, said famously, quote, "And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, the laws all being flat? And if you cut them down, do you really think you would stand upright in the winds that would blow then?" So will we establish and reestablish rules and procedures that show mutual respect for one another as senators and respect for this body we are honored to serve? I sincerely hope that conversation begins and begins soon. I want to say a word about the leaders of the Judiciary Committee. Chuck Grassley is my friend. He's been my friend for a long time. We do a lot of legislation together. We have a difference in political views. He's a loyal Republican. I'm a loyal Democrat. We have adjoining states, and we find some things that we can work on in common. I want to say personally to him, thank you for your leadership on this committee. I think there are moments when the White House and even your staff got the best of you, but I trust you, Chuck Grassley, in terms of where this committee's going. You have it within your power to restore the traditions of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I hope that you will. I'll join you in that effort. I want to say a word about Dianne Feinstein, too. She's been the subject of more attacks by my colleagues than I've ever heard any member face in the Senate. It's just not fair. Dianne Feinstein is a woman of integrity. She is a person who is caring, and she has given a major part of her life in public service at so many different levels. Some of the charges and innuendo, which I've heard on the floor of the Senate, are unbefitting this body, and she does not deserve them. I thank Senator Collins yesterday for specifically saying that in her remarks. I couldn't be more happy than to join her in those comments. And I want to say a word about protesting and mob rule. I will tell you that if you believe in freedom of speech and our right as a citizen to petition our government, then you accept some tough consequences. There are things that are said and done in the name of free speech which you may not agree with. Violence is never acceptable. Let me make that clear. But the decision that's about to be made in the United States is not being made by a mob. It is not mob rule. It is a decision made by men and women of the United States Senate who are acting in accordance with the United States Constitution. And one last point on the subject. This is one that I always remind my colleagues and even my opponents of. I believe the hottest ring in hell is reserved for those who attack our children and our families. If you want to take me out on an issue, so be it. Leave my family and my kids alone. That ought to be a rule on both sides of the aisle. There's another issue which we need to face squarely. Will victims of sexual violence be more or less likely to step forward and tell their stories after this high-profile political battle ends? To Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, to her husband and her children, I'll never forget your brave testimony last Thursday. You gave new meaning to the term civic duty. You spoke not just for yourself, but for millions of sexual violence victims who will never, ever have that opportunity. I'm sorry, genuinely sorry, for the pain that you and your family have endured. And I'm sorry you were mocked by President Trump at his rally in Mississippi last Tuesday. The Washington Post reported, and I quote, "The president laid into Ford with the ruthlessness of an attack dog and the pacing of a stand-up comedian. The crowd roared with laughter and applause." End of quote. No one could have been surprised with the president's performance. And when I hear repeated over and over again on the other side of the aisle, we wanted to treat her just like we'd have our wife or daughter to be treated, that certainly didn't happen when it came to the president's comments. We owe it to our wives, daughters, granddaughters, and all the women and men in this country who've been victimized to treat them with respect, not ridicule. We owe it to these victims to listen, learn, and stand with them as they relive their shattering experiences. I believe the debate over this nomination has created a stronger force in our nation for justice for victims of sexual violence, and I hope those who step forward know that they are not alone. Thank you for your courage. Tomorrow's another day. We are blessed to live in a democracy which protects our freedoms and gives our citizens the last word at the polling place. Today, I will cast my vote in the Senate in opposition to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court.
President.
The senator for Iowa.
Before Senator Grassley starts, I ask unanimous consent that Manpreet Taji, a Judiciary staffer in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the day.
Without objection.
No, you're good. Thank you.
Mr. President,
The senator for Iowa.
before I speak, I ask unanimous consent that following my remarks and those of Senators Schumer and McConnell, all post-cloture time be considered expired on this nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I come one final time in support of Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Democratic leaders did everything in their power to make Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation about anything except his judicial record and his outstanding academic qualifications. The Democratic leaders promised to oppose Judge Kavanaugh confirmation from day one and used every play in the book to accomplish that goal. Even though the Senate had access to more of Judge Kavanaugh's records than we've had for any other Supreme Court nominee, Democratic leaders tried to bury the Judiciary Committee in mountains of irrelevant paperwork. When routine process arguments failed, they resorted to outright character assassination of the judge. Their smear campaign featured baseless allegations of perjury and claims that as a teenager, he participated in gang rapes of women. I've been around long enough to see ugly left-wing smear campaigns against Supreme Court nominees, but this was beyond the pale, even beyond Judge Thomas and Anita Hill, and I was there. I'm encouraged that most of my colleagues had the courage to stand against the politics of personal destruction. Ignored in the media circus that the Democrat leaders created was Judge Kavanaugh's extraordinary record as a judge and also as a citizen. I've said from the day the President announced Judge Kavanaugh's nomination on July 9 that Judge Kavanaugh is quite possibly the most qualified person ever nominated. Some of the brightest legal minds, Judge Kavanaugh has set himself apart. The Supreme Court, in at least 12 separate cases, adopted positions advanced in Judge Kavanaugh's person ever nominated to the Supreme Court. He has spent 25 years of his career at the highest levels of the government, including the last 12 years as a judge on the second most important federal court. Judge Kavanaugh's record on the D.C. Circuit has been remarkable, outstandingly remarkable. On a court containing some of the brightest legal minds, Judge Kavanaugh has set himself apart. The Supreme Court, in at least 12 separate cases, adopted positions advanced in Judge Kavanaugh's lower court opinions.
As liberal law professor Amir wrote in the New York Times, quote, "Good appellate judges faithfully follow the Supreme Court. Great ones influence and help steer it. Several of Judge Kavanaugh's most important ideas and arguments have found their way into Supreme Court opinions." End of Professor Amar's quote. Judge Kavanaugh will not only bring his keen intellect and deep knowledge of the law to the Supreme Court, he will bring some other very important judicial characteristics as well. First among these is a proper understanding of the role of a judge in our constitutional system. He knows that a judge should interpret and apply law as written, not how he wishes it were written. Because, as we all know, it's Congress's job to write the laws, not judges. He has explained in numerous cases that the fundamental goal of the separation of powers under our constitutional system is the protection of individual liberty. He has interpreted the Constitution according to text, history, and tradition, not his own personal views. And that is exactly the type of a person we need on the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh has also demonstrated judicial independence and courage. As an example, in the 2 years after he was appointed to the D.C. Circuit by President George W. Bush, he ruled against Bush administration agencies on 23 cases. So don't let anybody tell you that he is obligated to a President Trump. We can expect that Justice Kavanaugh will be beholden to no one and nothing except the Constitution. Judge Kavanaugh also has a well-earned reputation for collegiality. He has an excellent relationship with all of his colleagues in the D.C. Circuit, and his judicial record demonstrates the same. Indeed, Judge Kavanaugh was in the majority in 97% of the cases that he participated in that D.C. Circuit. His Democratic appointed colleagues were as likely to join majority opinions written by Judge Kavanaugh as his Republican appointed colleagues were. He will bridge the divide in the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh has also shown a dedication to public service, to mentorship, and to diversity. He spent all but 3 years of his legal career in public service. Judge Kavanaugh is a proven mentor to law students and young lawyers. Judge Kavanaugh has taught courses at Harvard Law School and other top law schools for many years. The Senate Judiciary Committee received a letter in support of his confirmation from these former students. They wrote, quote, "We will have differing views on political issues surrounding the confirmation process, but we will agree on one thing. Judge Kavanaugh is a rigorous thinker, a devoted teacher, and a gracious person." End of quote. Federal judges also play a very important role in mentoring the next generation of lawyers by hiring law clerks. Judge Kavanaugh has clearly taken seriously this mentorship role. His former law clerk submitted a letter to this committee strongly supporting his confirmation. I quote from that letter, "It was a tremendous stroke of luck to work for and be mentored by a person of his strength of character, generosity of spirit, intellectual capacity, and unwavering care for his family, friends, colleagues, and us, his law clerks, end of quote. One of the areas where Judge Kavanaugh has had a particular impact is his commitment to diversity. More than half of his law clerks have been female. When confirmed to the Supreme Court, his class of law clerks will be all female, the first time in the history of the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh's female law clerk sent the committee a letter, and this is what this letter from the law clerk says, quote, "We know all too well that women in the workplace still face challenges, inequality, and even harassment. Among other things, women do not enjoy a representative share of prestigious clerkships or high-profile legal positions. But this committee and the American public more broadly should be aware of the important work Judge Kavanaugh has done to remedy those disparities. In our view, the judge has been one of the strongest advocates in the federal judiciary for women lawyers," end of quote. Well, as I think about history, it leads me to this. The confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh is particularly meaningful to me. 31 years ago, left-wing groups and their Senate allies fired the opening shots in the judicial confirmation wars. They engaged at that time in unprecedented character assassination against President Reagan's nominee, Judge Robert Bork. Since then, they have only escalated this war, slandering several Republican nominees to the Supreme Court and expanding their tactics to lower court nominees. So then, as history tells us, more than 3 decades later, left-wing groups and their Democratic allies in this body went back to the very same playbook. They tried the very same character assassination tactics against the person nominated to the very same seat that Judge Robert Bork was supposed to fill. They succeeded 31 years ago, but this time they failed. So I look forward to voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh this afternoon and to greeting him as Justice Kavanaugh the next time I see him. I yield.
Mr. President, I know that. Thank you, Mr. President. I know that the Democratic leader is scheduled to speak next. If there is a minute that I could take in between there, I just wanted to comment on a colleague that spoke yesterday, Senator Collins. I had wanted to come to the floor to speak on her behalf, but too many other people were speaking at that time. People remarked on her comments that they reflected the fact that she does her homework, and she indeed did. And I simply wanted to relay this anecdote. When I helped to introduce Judge Kavanaugh to my fellow former senators, former colleagues, I think of all of the meetings that we had, and many of them were with lawyers who are senators. Probably the most thorough meeting of all was that held with Senator Collins. She had clearly done her homework, and the interview with Judge Kavanaugh consumed more than 2 hours without a break. It was a grilling that could have been done by any fine lawyer, because she had clearly done her homework and was very well prepared. And I know she did further follow up after that. But I do want to commend her for the depth and the breadth of her comments. And as the Wall Street Journal this morning said, Mr. President, she not only debated like it used to be done in this body with evidence and sound reasoning, but also a reference to our founding principles and the higher things that should motivate our public service and our discussions here on the Senate floor. So I wanted to take this opportunity to commend her for her remarks, but to tell those who don't know her that this was par for the course. Her performance was magnificent, but it was not out of the ordinary for Senator Collins. Just wanted my colleagues to know that. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President,
Democratic leader.
are we in a quorum, Mr. President?
We are in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, in a short time, the Senate will take a final vote on the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. The road that led us here has been bitter, angry, and partisan, steeped in hypocrisy and hyperbole and resentment and outrage. From start to finish, President Trump's nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court has been one of the saddest moments in the history of the Senate. When the history of the Senate is written, this chapter will be a flashing red warning light of what to avoid. Truly, Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation is a low moment for the Senate, for the court, for the country. The Republican majority has conducted one of the least transparent, least fair, most biased processes in Senate history, slanting the table from the very beginning to produce their desired result. Why do I say this? Because they withheld over 90% of the nominee's record from the Senate and the American people. Because they refused to allow Dr. Ford to call a single corroborating witness at the hearing, including the only other eyewitness to the incident. Because they refused to have an independent investigation of the facts before the hearing in order to inform the questioning. Because they hired an outside prosecutor to question Dr. Ford as if she were on trial. Because the White House kept the FBI investigation on a short leash, dictating the scope and even the kinds of questions the FBI was allowed to ask. Because Republican senators, sensing after Dr. Ford's testimony that a debate about the truth and facts was not working, adopted a cynical new strategy to shout, pound the table, and portray Judge Kavanaugh as the helpless victim of some unseen partisan conspiracy. Because the President of the United States, stooping to new depths, even for him, chose to stand before a crowd of thousands and cruelly ridicule a survivor of sexual assault. And because this grossly distorted, biased, unfair process run by the Republican majority, the Senate is about to elevate a nominee who doesn't belong on the nation's highest bench. Now, why doesn't Judge Kavanaugh belong on the bench in the nation's highest court? Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he obscured his views, shrouding his jurisprudence in smoke so thick the American people would never know what he really believed. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he was chosen by a president and a far-right organization, both dedicated to overturning and undermining Roe v. Wade, and he did not a thing to refute the presumption that he would want to overturn it too. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he was chosen by far-right organizations that are bent on repealing health care protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions, and he did nothing to refute the presumption that he would too. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he believes that presidents should not be subject to investigations of any kind while in office, a distortion of our founding principle that no person is above the law. Judge Kavanaugh does not belong on the bench because his jurisprudence is deeply skeptical of environmental protections, consumer protections, workers' rights, civil rights, LGBT rights, and rights of treaties and agreements with Native Americans, and a host of other hard-earned rights. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he has repeatedly misled the Senate, putting into serious doubt his credibility, and a judge must be credible, believable, and honest above all. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he is an extreme partisan, something we have seen from his earliest days in his career and reconfirmed when he gave one of the bitterest, most partisan testimonies ever presented by a nominee. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because of his injudicious demeanor. His partisan screed will go down ignominiously in history, and made it clear it would be virtually impossible for him to rule impartially on the Supreme Court. Judges must be temperate, judicious, even-handed. Judge Kavanaugh is anything but. Republican leaders knew before he was nominated that Judge Kavanaugh was a very flawed choice. But once President Trump selected him, Republicans decided they had to rush him through. They became a steamroller over truth, fairness, and our traditions of bipartisan cooperation, any means necessary to reach their desired end. They blamed Dr. Ford and Democrats for Judge Kavanaugh's flaws. They were intent on shrouding the truth because they knew that if the truth came to light, Judge Kavanaugh would be exposed as a truly flawed nominee. So, my colleagues, my fellow Americans, what is the appropriate response? Our country needs to have a reckoning on these issues, and there is only one remedy. Change must come from where change in America always begins, the ballot box. So to Americans, the so many millions who are outraged by what happened here, there's one answer: vote. If you believe Dr. Ford and other brave women who came forward and you want to vindicate their sacrifice, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should uphold women's rights, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court must protect health care and our pre-existing conditions that are protected now, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should defend workers, consumers, the environment, civil rights, native populations, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should be a check on an overreaching president, vote. If you believe the process here in the Senate was a sham and you believe Americans deserve better, vote. If you believe that Supreme Court justices should conform to the highest standards of character, impartiality, temperament, and above all, honesty and credibility, vote. I understand, I share the deep anguish that millions of Americans are experiencing today. But I say to you, my fellow Americans, there is one answer: vote. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
The Constitution of the United States was made not merely for the generation that then existed, but for posterity. Those are the words of Henry Clay. Mr. President, Kentucky's own. They underscore that the decision United States senators will make today will echo in the history of our nation. The very survival of our constitutional form of government requires an expert and independent judiciary. Without fair and impartial courts of justice, as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. The courts guard our rights, and the Senate guards our courts. That, Mr. President, is why today is such an important day. That is why the vote we take this afternoon, a vote to confirm a new Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, represents one of the most consequential decisions a senator ever makes. The members of this body are duty-bound to ensure we confirm justices of the Supreme Court who are men and women of the highest character and the most superlative qualifications. So fortunately, that is just the sort of nominee who stands before us today. 12 weeks ago, the President nominated a jurist who's been described by legal peers of all political stripes as a superstar, a serious scholar, and who is legendary for his preparation and possesses the qualifications, the temperament, and the judicial philosophy to be an excellent Associate Justice. The President nominated a brilliant student of the law. Those who taught and knew the nominee at Yale say, quote, "It is hard to name anyone with judicial credentials as strong as Judge Kavanaugh." They describe a true intellectual, a leading thinker, and a wonderful mentor and teacher. And those he's mentored, a diverse group of bright young lawyers who've clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, talk about his work ethic, his unflinching, honest advice, and his fundamental humility. For 12 weeks, the Senate has seen that this is not empty praise. We've seen the legendary preparation of a tireless judge. We've seen the patience of a committed mentor and teacher. We've seen the humility of a true intellectual who let his record speak for itself. Each of us have seen this for ourselves. Every senator who came into this process with an open mind has seen that very same Brett Kavanaugh firsthand. We've seen his brilliance, his painstaking thoroughness on display in the 300-plus opinions he issued on the D.C. Circuit. For 12 years, Judge Kavanaugh excelled on the bench that many experts see as the second most important court in our nation. We've seen his geniality and kindness firsthand in our private meetings with the nominee, precisely the collegial approach that is so necessary on the court. We've seen his professional excellence as we reviewed more pages of documents pertaining to Judge Kavanaugh's career than for any other Supreme Court nomination in our history. Pages that depict a meticulous and dedicated public servant. And yes, we have now studied the results of seven FBI background investigations, inquiries that have produced no evidence whatsoever to corroborate any prior misconduct, but rather are consistent with all we know about this nominee's sterling character. This historically tall mountain of evidence adds up to one clear message. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is among the very best our nation has to offer. He will make the Senate and the country proud. He will serve with distinction on our highest court. He unquestionably deserves confirmation, and the country deserves such a Supreme Court justice. Now, Mr. President, as I've explained, the stakes are always high, where a Supreme Court confirmation is concerned. But this time, the stakes are higher, a lot higher than they've been in the past. I can't sum this up better than our friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Maine, put it in her historic remarks yesterday. This is what the senior senator from Maine said. It is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy. She said, when passions are most inflamed is when fairness is most in jeopardy. We all know the events of recent weeks have strained the country's comedy and fanned the flames of partisan discord. But even more critically, our very commitment to the basic principles of fairness and justice is also being tested. Basic principles of fairness and justice being tested right here. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is also a vote to send a clear message about what the Senate is. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is the chamber in which the politics of intimidation and personal destruction do not win the day. That this is the body whose members themselves uphold the same commitment to American justice that we seek in the judges we examine. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is a vote to end this brief, dark chapter in the Senate's history and turn the page toward a brighter tomorrow. The chamber we are privileged to occupy is often called the world's greatest deliberative body for good reason. We're called the world's greatest deliberative body for a good reason. When the rubber meets the road, when the hour is critical, when a historic precedent needs to be set, the United States Senate most often finds its way to doing what is right. Today, we can honor that history. We can vote to turn away from the darkness. We can vote to set a precedent about fairness and judgment that will define this body for the better. We can vote to confirm an excellent Supreme Court justice who will make the Senate and the American people proud. I yield the floor.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. Under the previous question, all post-cloture time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk may continue.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Zoom.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And there you have it, folks. It's done. Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been confirmed as the 114th Justice of the Supreme Court. A historic day, and we thank you for joining us here on Right Side Broadcasting. For those of you watching right now we have two separate feeds going here. So we have a one feed of just the floor, and then that is actually named, the title of the feed is voting on the Senate floor. And then we have a feed up of the Trump rally. We're showing this in a split screen. What we're going to do right now is we're going to end the stream on the Supreme Court feed. If you're watching on that feed, please come over to our Trump rally feed, as we're going to be live at the Trump rally. We've actually been live for a while now in Topeka, Kansas. It's going to be a huge celebration there tonight, I can tell you that. The lines are huge. If you remember Tennessee, in Johnson City, the lines are about as long as woo, that was loud. So the lines here are incredibly long in Topeka, Kansas. Our crew, Sherwin Wendell and Tom O'Neill, and our cameraman James are live right now in Topeka, and we have been shooting video of the line all day. Before we go back inside of the arena there for the rally tonight, you can see the entire thing here on RSBN. So share our stream, and if you're watching at the other stream on our YouTube channel, we're going to close that out and move over to the Trump rally feed now. So we hope you'll join us over there. Thank y'all.
The idea is Wichita. That's you. That's great. Big vote today. Yeah. Better even boost. Oh, that's right. I like the